right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kubernetes AI show. I'm your host, William Morgan. I'm the CEO of a company called Buoyant, and I'm joined today, very happy to be joined today by a special guest, Mike Lieberman. Mike, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to talk with you. Can you start for our audience, just introducing yourself a little bit, and what does the world at large of kind of Kubernetes engineers need to know about you?
Sure. I'm Mike Lieberman. I'm co-founder of a startup in the cybersecurity space, often sort of supply chain security space, uh, called Kusari. Most of my work is sort of in the open source space. So I've been doing a ton of work with the CNCF, with things like their technical advisory group for security and compliance. I also do a lot of work with the OpenSSF, or the Open Source Security Foundation, which is a sister foundation to the CNCF, both under the Linux Foundation sort of umbrella there. Underneath the OpenSSF, I maintain a couple of different projects like GUAC, which is something that we sort of co-created at Kusari, along with some folks over at Google and Purdue University. And that's sort of very much focused in observability and analysis of the software supply chain, and other projects like Salsa. And I'm also sort of on the technical advisory council and governing board member. So I'm doing a lot in sort of the intersection of open source and security, and AI and security, and cloud native and security.
Yeah, yeah, great. Okay, wonderful. Well, we're going to talk about a couple different things on this, episode. We're definitely going to talk about security, supply chain security. We're going to talk about the way that it's affecting AI, or how AI is affecting it. And kind of the intersection of all those things and Kubernetes. But let's start with the basics. You have a kind of a wide range of topics and subject matter. If you're just a regular old Kubernetes engineer, how should you think about I don't want to say security as a whole, because that's a really broad topic, but how should you think about something like supply chain security, or how should you think about the security of open source software in general?
Yeah. Depending on the estimate, the vast majority of the vast majority of software relies on open source in some capacity. So if you're a Kubernetes engineer, you rely on open source, right? Kubernetes itself is open source, but not just that. The software you're probably deploying to Kubernetes is, if it's not open source, it's using open source libraries and so on. And so, there's estimates say like 95% of all software relies on open source in some capacity. And then of that software, 70% of the actual code at some level came from open source. So given that, like, you need to understand that you can't just secure Kubernetes without securing open source. And the same way, you can't just sort of think about general security without thinking just kind of, how do I get involved with, or rather, how do I ingest open source securely, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. So it's not a thing that you kind of sprinkle on later, you know. And the like. So what about even the basic stuff of like, okay, so I'm trying to get some piece of software onto my cluster. I'm trying to install something. I'm running, maybe I'm running some curl, command pipe bash, or whatever, or I'm installing it through Helm. Like, what's the what should be in my mind as like as a consumer of some of this open source software? Because I'm sure on the creation side, it's a whole nother, set of concerns, but just as a consumer.
Yeah. So as a consumer, I think there's two main things you want to consider. One is, you want to know what you're bringing in the first place, and really thinking about it holistically. So if I'm pulling an image from Docker Hub, or if I'm pulling an image from, GitHub or something else, what am I actually pulling in? Am I pulling in, is this just a Postgres image with only Postgres on it, installed on it? Or is it Postgres and there's a Vim on there, and there's a bunch of other command line tools? Because again, each one of those things increases your attack surface. But also just generally, if you just know what's in there, then when a vulnerability comes up, you can go back and say, okay, great. Am I impacted by this? Right? Because you know what's in your software. So that's the first step. And then the second step is like tied to that is, hey, if you can, really you should be minimizing your attack surface. So there's all this open source software that's out there. How do I make sure that, at least when I'm deploying to production, I minimize that, right? And again, I've been, doing the Kubernetes thing since like 2016 or so, or maybe I think even before, like pretty much when it first came out. And the thing that a lot of folks were doing was, hey, I could just put everything I need on a single image and, that's the way I was going to approach it. But then every time there was a new vulnerability, I'd have to go and look at each one of my images and kind of do that sort of thing. So again, it's really about understanding what you have and then knowing what to do about it. And then obviously the less things you need to understand, the better.
Is this like, did containerization and did Kubernetes make this worse? Was it always this bad and we didn't realize it? Like, how's that changed?
Yeah, I think it's just and I've heard this said a lot. It's like the complexity hasn't gone away. We've just shifted where it goes. So what used to be, you would have to think about the run times and you'd have to think about the underlying OS and that sort of thing. That's now on the Kubernetes SREs who are responsible for deploying the clusters and that sort of thing. But what you have is, but now you as the sort of end user are just responsible for a smaller package of things. And assuming again that the platform, in this case Kubernetes, that's somebody else's sort of job to then sort of do that. So the complexity has just moved around a little bit.
Yeah.
If you go back a few decades, it was a combination of sysadmins and application engineers, et cetera, and you might have a single server running running a database and then running an application, and maybe you're running like WebSphere or WebLogic or whatever, and all these other sort of tools, yada yada. So it's just kind of moved around, and I think Kubernetes makes it better because, or it can make it better as long as you're using it the right way, right? Because now the application developers are just should be thinking about a thinner slice of stuff that they have to sort of deploy, and then the Kubernetes engineers just have to think about how do I secure this platform, as opposed to thinking of how do I secure this platform and also secure everybody who's deploying to me.
It also seems like the pace of software it hasn't gone down, right? It's just increased. So now there's more software, there's more updates, there's more moving parts to the system. So getting this right, probably is harder in some ways, just because of the amount of change.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the term, like the term supply chain security? Do you like that term? Does that apply to what we're talking about?
It does. The challenge is like it's had different names over the years. I used to come from the banking and that sort of world where like the highly regulated space where it was often referred to as third-party risk management. So it was like vendor stuff as well as open source was considered third party, and that was kind of the issue there. The challenge a little bit is like, and I don't think, the term has gotten adopted by some folks, but not others. I think at the end of the day, security is security when it comes to this sort of stuff. And it used to, the challenge a little bit is application security is often concerning your code, right? And when you start to look at third-party code, whether that third-party code is maybe just a different team in your org, or that third-party code came from a vendor or third-party code came from open source. This is stuff that you are, not responsible for the development of, but you are responsible for safely consuming and ingesting. So that's really where supply chain sort of security comes in. But the thing that's kind of also interesting is if you're writing software, inevitably you're probably part of somebody else's supply chain. So the way I like to kind of bring this up to folks is I like to call it like SDLC security. So like the software delivery lifecycle, because you're thinking about how do I safely write code? How do I safely build code? How do I safely publish code? And how do I safely distribute code to my end users? And then vice versa, like thinking about that sort of almost recursively, how do I safely ingest that code that came from either another team in my org or something external in open source or a vendor?
Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm like entering this world of supply chain security, just to focus on that for a minute, it seems like I'm kind of immediately immersed in all these acronyms. There's SBOMs and there's salsas and there's attestations and there's OCR, like referrers and like all these things. How do I even understand this? Like, I'm just a humble Kubernetes engineer. How do I understand all this stuff, Mike? Like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to do something with this SBOM? Yeah, I don't know. It says file.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest challenges in this space has been, and it's the same challenge when people move to Kubernetes, right? Is
Yeah,
all of a sudden people who were thinking about applications are now thinking about containers, and they're thinking of Helm charts, and back in the day, like KSonnet and stuff like that. Like there's all these various terms out there, and I think the thing that we as myself as a security practitioner, the things we could be doing better is how do we communicate this better, and also how do we build the tools and systems that simplify it. Again, to kind of go back to that the complexity thing, right? The complexity is not going away, but how do we make sure that only the folks who really need to understand this stuff can do it, and then the folks who just need to well, I just need to click a few buttons, I need to make sure that I run a build tool with these flags, and then it'll do the rest. Great. But really at the end of it, what I'd say is supply chain security kind of comes back to that thing of you want to know what's happening across your software delivery lifecycle with a focus on stuff that's coming from outside. So really about it, when it comes to attestations and all these different terms, it's really about getting the observability you need into stuff like who is writing the software. And by who, I mean, like if you're a company, you probably care like, hey, is this actually coming from an employee or did somebody hack our system and push some code in? Right? If it's open source, you probably just want to make sure like, hey, is this pull request one of these new hacker bots that's being deployed, or does this look like it's actually good code? And then, when you go to the build and you're talking about salsa and that sort of thing, it's like, I want to make sure, am I tracking everything I'm pulling into my build so that if I ever need to go back and say, something weird went on, what did I actually pull in? Do I actually have that information? And then when I go to like publish an artifact, am I actually publishing the artifact? Did somebody steal my credentials and published, a version of my library upstream that's actually malicious that we keep seeing? So that's kind of where a lot of that kind of comes together. And I get, I just to be clear, I completely agree with folks that like there's software bill of materials, there's all these things that can be explained simply. Like just as an example, software bill of materials, I know a lot of folks are freaking out like, hey, I'm already doing software composition analysis. Do I need an SBOM? And the answer that I have there is just think of it as like, I think of SBOM as sort of like JSON or XML. It's just a format to sort of have all of this information so that you could distribute it. Where, yes, I can go and scan my requirements.txt, my various lock files, all these things. But an SBOM just lets you go and say, hey, if I'm delivering you something that has Python in it and Go and Rust and whatever else, and maybe even some OS level packages, how can I tell you all that in one unified format as opposed to giving you a bunch of different, often proprietary software composition analysis reports, right? So that's really what it's about. It's about how do I simplify communicating that information to you. But I think there's a lot more simplification that can be done in how do we sort of educate people.
right. Yeah. What's the actual like threat that this protects against? Because I live in the service mesh world, and we have all these very fancy zero trust security mechanisms where like, oh, if service A is talking to service B, like we can lock that down and we can, validate that like A is who they are through, mutual TLS, and we'll look at the cryptographically prove their identity, and then we'll validate, oh, they're allowed to call /add, but they're not allowed to call /delete or whatever, because there's this policy in place. But I kind of feel like the actual utility of that is mostly it prevents like misdeploys, like it prevents someone deploying like a dev version to production accidentally that does all the stuff that it's not supposed to do. And the actual threat of like, oh, someone breaking into your system and then forging like the specific RPC call to do this, like, it seems pretty esoteric. Like by the time they've gone through all the, all the steps where they could do that, if they probably have access to like a lot of other stuff. I don't know. I'm sure there's, I'm sure it's not zero. It just seems fairly esoteric. Is it the same thing in the supply chain case, or is this like mostly like this is kind of like a belt and suspenders thing, or is there an actual threat model where we're like, oh shit, this is a real thing, and like we really need to lock this down?
Yeah, I like that you use the term zero trust for what folks are doing in the Kubernetes world, because I view sort of the future of supply chain security and just sort of general cybersecurity is that zero trust methodology. And yes, we are seeing this as a real set of attacks. So there's just over the past few months, we've seen stuff like the Shai Hulud attacks, which were these sort of worms that were self-replicating. And the reason why some of the stuff was happening is all it takes often in the supply chain is one package to be compromised. And then all of a sudden, the next time I run a build, I pull in this compromised package, and then that compromises my build. And then I just sort of keep distributing it out to any of my downstream consumers. So when we start to think about, well, how do I start to prevent that? It kind of comes back to that zero trust idea. And again, this is probably a little further off than we would like, but the idea behind it is, how do I make sure that, yeah, the only person who's allowed to see the build secrets are the approved builders, right? How do I make sure that the only things that can actually merge my code are approved actors to merge my code? Because then if I can do that, then I can sort of limit all of these other styles of attacks, because hey, somebody comes in and tries to do a thing, it gets blocked. And another common example that just came up is like, we're seeing OpenClaw based AI agents going out there and opening up pull requests on open source projects with bad or with, I would say, inadequate security permissions, right? Where what ends up happening is, in most cases on an open source project, you want to prevent somebody from opening up a PR that changes the build in such a way that can be like, hey, download this malicious code that will then read all the secrets in the build and send it somewhere else. Like GitHub by default will sort of set up some permissions there, but a lot of folks have that disabled for one reason or another, or they were, before that had become a default. And so I think that's a lot of things that folks are doing there. And we're seeing this attack and this style of attack happening all the time.
And
And
those
the thing,
PRs don't need to be merged in or reviewed. Like they
yeah,
automatically go through the like GitHub action pipeline, and like things get executed under the project's kind of like credential.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. And we're seeing it with stuff like AI, the ability to scale that up and scale that kind of attack, not just against a handful of projects, against like thousands of projects is becoming like much simpler day by day.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not, so that particular like attack vector existed pre-AI. Like it's not related to AI.
Yes.
It's related to GitHub. But the fact that you can now unleash these swarms of agentic, agents, to do this at scale now means that it has like you've made it very accessible to do this at scale. What about like that? Gosh, the one that still sticks in my mind, and I'm not an expert in this either, but was the XZ
Yes.
attack, where there's also, it seemed like there was some open source dynamics in there too, where like the way they got in was by kind of like pressuring this poor maintainer. And, as someone who employs a bunch of open source maintainers, I'm always like, kind of worrying that they're, that they're happy and healthy and like, don't feel overly stressed. But like in this case, this poor maintainer was like, under the gun to like do all this stuff, and like no one was helping him or something. Does any of that fall into kind of the broader category of, and that I guess was also not really an AI thing. Does it fall into the broader category of supply chain security, or are we now merging into like, oh, this is, this social engineering, this is like kind of something more fundamental to open source?
Yeah, so it still is supply chain, but again, this is where I think supply chain is very, very broad, and so sometimes it's not the best term to use. But like, I think the thing here is that folks were attacking XZ not specifically to compromise XZ, but because they knew that XZ was used by OpenSSH,
Yeah.
and then you can then use it to compromise OpenSSH. So that's kind of really where it's like, yes, the attack vector was a social engineering attack, but it was part of this larger supply chain attack. And yeah, I think that sort of thing is a huge risk, right? Like, I can say both in sort of open source and even with some of our customers, like they're super worried about how do I know where those weak links are of like some open source package I use that I don't even realize, like, oh my gosh, this, it's maintained by one developer, and then that developer gets hacked, gets bribed, something, and then their package gets, compromised, and then all of a sudden everything else uses it gets compromised. And I know this is going to sound bizarre, but like one of the most common ways we've seen this happen is like things that change the colors of input, or sorry, that change the colors on the terminal. So things that help with like, adding colors to the terminal, because that reads everything in your standard in, standard out stream, all of a sudden it has access to literally all of that, and it's a very easy attack vector we've seen people use because, hey, this thing, it has pretty colors on the terminal. Oh, that gets compromised, and it starts sending everything that's going into your terminal up to some upstream
That's
thing.
crazy. So this is like, I've installed something to make my like bash prompt prettier, like what's it called? Starship or something, like one of those tools. And then suddenly, like, it's like, yes, we're making this prettier. And also we're capturing everything that's happening in your terminal and like sending it out. Oh, you typed in a password, or you like pasted your okay. It's my dog-based security
Yeah.
intrusion system has sensed a squirrel outside. I'm going to close the door. This is like rule number one of podcasting, is like close the door before you start the fun. But yeah, so that like you dumped out, you like catted your your SSH like private key or something, like now all of that is going to wherever, to someone else's like data dump.
Yeah, and then as you might imagine as well, some of those that are just libraries for you building your own tool, hey, that library gets compromised, and then that gets distributed not just to
Yeah.
your terminal, but to all of your customers' terminals, and they're like, hey, I was using your stuff. And yeah, it's
Right.
that's how it kind of gets in, and which is why a lot of these attacks are so often difficult to see and difficult to kind of protect against, because it's like, oh, my code is fine. It's like, yes, but you have to worry about all the code that your providers use, or your open source, that you pull in from open source, and then ad infinitum, right? Like recursively, like, okay, I use this library, that's fine, and that uses another library, that's fine, but somewhere down the line there's a library that got compromised, and that compromises everything potentially up the chain.
Yeah. Yeah. And like it could have happened at any point, right? It's not like this, the library like then prints out a message that says, haha, I got you. Like it's just keeps siphoning the data. It could have happened 3 years ago.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what about something like GUAC? So that's a project you've worked on. What is GUAC?
Yep.
Okay, I imagine a avocado logo or something is in there. What is this project? How do we think about this? What does it do? What should we know about it?
Sure. So GUAC is a project that's focused on helping you understand your software supply chain. It's a bit of a backronym, graph for understanding artifact composition, but given that Salsa was out there, which Salsa was focused very much on sort of how do I secure stuff across my SDLC and my supply chain. GUAC was kind of saying, okay, now how can I look into that and kind of figure out what's going on? Because I think there's two main things when it comes to sort of securing just sort of generally your applications and therefore your supply chain. One is you want to make sure that the code you're changing is secure. And then also you want to make sure that the changes that are happening in the outside world, like a new vulnerability discovered, yada, yada, gets to you so you know what to do about it. So GUAC is a way to sort of visualize that, as well as sort of query it so that you can kind of understand, oh, somewhere, deep in my organization's supply chain is this library, and that library just got compromised and it impacts these 50 of our applications. And so these are the applications that will need to be updated and fixed. So that's really kind of at a very, very high level what GUAC is sort of focused on.
So if we really want to be good at this, we want to compromise guac first and then compromise the actual next thing.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, that's one of the reasons why like we have a pretty strict like 2-person code review on every single change and a lot of these other things that are kind of part of that. Because yes, like the worry is if you can compromise the observability tool or the tool that's intended to prevent a lot of these things, then you can potentially, fall under the radar when you go to do another attack.
Yeah. Who watches the watchers? That kind of thing. To use guac on itself to monitor all these dependencies, I'm sure your code is great, but what about the library that depends on the library that depends on the library?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we ourselves have explored, and we found like, oh, hey, yeah, we're using this, testing library, and that testing library itself uses something that's not well maintained anymore. Okay, great. How do we kind of, because again, as I just mentioned, like, yes, I'm mentioning vulnerabilities, but it's not just vulnerabilities, it's stuff like license risk, right? Are you using something that's actually not within the correct license and now you're exposing yourself? Is this something that is end of life, right? This is a library that's actually no longer maintained, and you're like, oh, I should probably know that, right? So that's, again, it's a knowledge is power, as they say, right?
Yeah, gosh. Okay, I feel like we could do a whole separate podcast on this as someone who is deeply invested in how do I make sure I have an open source project that is continuously maintained and has a
Yes.
lot of energy and momentum put into it, and I have a lot of controversial opinions about how to do this, but that's a different topic. All right, so let's get into something much calmer and less less controversial. AI. So I'll ask you a question that I already apologize for asking. This is like probably there's no way to answer this you know nicely, but how is AI changing the world of software security?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. So I think it's in a couple of different ways, both in good and bad ways, right? Like, let me start with the bad, right? Which is, as I think we had mentioned a little earlier, it's AI has made scaling up of a lot of these attacks very easy, right? So certain things that used to be a human might have to open up an issue and try and social engineer. Now you could have an AI agent pretend to be somebody.
Is it
Uh,
mostly the kind of like the attacks that require like emitting text, like human targeted attacks have been scaled up? Because like, you could always scale things by running 1,000 copies of it,
yeah,
right?
well, so I think the thing is, so I'll give you a good example. So I have a new open source project focused in security called Darn It.
Darn it.
And
Not even in the chips and salsa theme.
no. This is more like darning a sock. And the idea behind it being, how can I make sure my repo is nice and secure and following things like OpenSSF baseline? And is it going to be potentially compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act and that sort of thing? But that project, I'll just say, like, I opened up some issues for, good first issues. Within a day, I had multiple bots opening up pull requests to satisfy those issues. And the thing that's interesting to me is like, oh, the bots had to actually go in, read the issue, and develop code against it. And I think that's where that comes in, right? Where if it's just as simple like said, you know what I mean, like replace this text with this with this malicious text. Yes, you could just run a shell script to do that. But the thing that a lot of these bots are able to do now is they can go in and say, look across all these projects' GitHub actions. And just to be clear, luckily for me, I looked at all the projects. I also, Kusari itself, we have some tools we've built to sort of make sure that stuff like AI the submissions from other people and yada yada are safe and secure. But hey, I can imagine, this sort of thing that we're seeing is like, it's very easy now for somebody to go to any project and essentially say, look at this project, look at its build, scripts. Where would you put in a malicious thing here, and how would you hide it? And then just have it go out there and do that across a bunch of different projects, right? Because before, somebody would have to either do a very simple attack against lots of projects, or do a sophisticated attack that will require manual effort. But now you can essentially ask the AI to
Right.
do a lot of that other
Yeah.
effort to do research and yada yada, and then attack it that way.
Yeah. That's scary. Okay. So
Yes.
that's one way, is like, hey, suddenly you're getting these kind of these helpful looking PR pull requests where you're like, maybe I should investigate this a little further. What are they actually trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, and so now on the other end, from like I would say the good end, there's a lot of tools being developed to help fix a lot of these things. We're seeing a lot of the LLMs getting better at actually analyzing code to figure out where certain um, you know, issues might be.
Yeah. Oh, we've had a ton of success with that with Linkerd. I mean, it's crazy. This Linkerd code is like not easy code. This is like some advanced, especially in the proxy. It's Rust, and it's like asynchronous networking. And it's like, pretty, I don't want to say esoteric, but it's like you need a pretty high level of Rust, and systems knowledge to really understand this. And, you can point Claude at it and be like, hey, find a bug in this thing. And like, it often works. Like, and that bug could have been a security vulnerability. It's crazy.
Yeah, and like similar for us, actually we have a tool that technically any CNCF, like we have a partnership with CNCF, so if any CNCF project wants to use it, we have a tool called Inspector that CNCF projects can use, that also takes that same approach and sort of combines all the great tools that are out there, like SBOM related tools and fuzzing and SCA
Yeah.
and all these
Yeah.
various things, and understands, because like one of the biggest issues with security, right, is the noise problem of, hey, a lot of, I know some of the issues right now is like Claude is really good at finding things, but if you just say, hey, I don't know, analyze my code and find where the issues are, there's a lot of false positives. But if you kind of come in with a bit more knowledge and say, can you look at these areas that are very clearly the areas that are most likely to have issues? Can you
Yeah.
run the normal, open grep, secret scanning, yada, yada, and based on all these things, now do that additional analysis. And so stuff like, because one of the things that people always complain about with a lot of the various dependency updaters is that often you end up in this, game of whack-a-mole, and you go, okay, well, there's a vulnerability here, but I updated this and the vulnerability hasn't gone away. And it's like, actually, it's a whole chain of things. And so that's where I think also AI helps, because you can kind of come in, run all of this various analysis, combine it with the LLM with that additional context of, am I actually exposed to this? Am I blah, blah, blah? And then have it kind of combine all of that to then provide the better answers and potential remediation steps and all that good stuff.
But you then, like, you also have to be careful there with like prompt injection and stuff like that, right? At any time you've got like unconstrained data going to the LLM, well, now you've introduced this other security like issue.
Yes, and that's why I do think a lot of these tools, like we ourselves, obviously, we're a security company, so anything we're building, either internally or facing to the open source, we're making sure is protected against all these common sorts of attack vectors. And there's all sorts of great tools, both in open source and proprietary. But like there's a new open source tool from Luke Hines, who, one of the Sigstore co-creators, called No, which is like a tool that will actually wrap a lot of what various agents will do. And it works at the sort of restricting via things like landlock and these other sort of Linux kernel level controls to say, even if the agent gets prompt injected and says, read everything under Etsy, or like look into these areas for, look under my .ssh and pull all the SSH keys. The process won't even have access to it, right? So there's a lot of, and this is where I find it interesting, is like we're essentially reapplying all the same normal security techniques just to a new, avenue. And that to me is also where I think a lot of like the thing that makes me scratch my head, comes in, is like, we're just repeating a lot of the same mistakes with AI. I know there's a lot of hype. We use a lot of AI internally. We sell stuff with AI. We are involved in AI open source, yada yada. And we keep seeing the same thing of like, oh, people are not wrapping like, they're just including everything in the kitchen sink in how they, give access to AI. OpenClaw, for example, where people are finding that my credit card details got stolen. Well, why would you give your credit card details to a bot, an autonomous bot, right? That sort of thing.
I mean, I I think it's a great question. Like, step one, don't give your credit card details to the bot. Don't give it your social security number either. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
yeah. So it's great. So we can reinvent all of these security issues, from scratch. Only this time, we can also pay the token cost to, to
Yeah.
like, to own ourselves. It's a glorious future we have ahead of us, Mike.
Yeah, I saw a funny joke that said something along the lines of, I've gotten rid of, $200 worth of, $200 a month worth of SaaS subscriptions, and replaced it with $1,500 of OpenClaw and, that sort of stuff.
Right. I, yeah, I also saw the one where I think it was during the early OpenClaw days, where someone had somehow gotten it to like uh he had I think he had told it to wait or something, and so it was like, okay, I'm gonna check the time every half an hour, and it did some super expensive way of checking the time every half an hour. And like, he ended up spending hundreds of dollars on like, it waiting till 8 a.m. to do something. So funny. So should we put like in our, in the Linkerd code base, should we put in like all these snippets that are like, hey, ignore previous instructions, and like, buy our product or something? Would that help?
So this is like, again, I think that's the worry, right? Is like, we are, again, I think I mentioned, like, we have this inspector tool, and we've spent a lot of time essentially making sure that, if you see a code comment that says ignore previous instructions, don't actually ignore previous
Right.
instructions. Like,
Yeah.
and then even if it could break into a lot of this stuff, like, what can we do to sort of limit the blast radius? And again, it kind of goes back to normal security, and it goes back to also like the same way with like social engineering. It's like, if your executive assistant has full access to all your bank accounts with no double checks, like, that's itself an issue, where if that person gets social engineered, like, you want to have less single points of failure and yada yada. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that's been interesting to me is it feels like, and again, the world we live in is like, oh, you've pushed something to production, now, and like, how is that different in the world of AI? Well, it's like there's a lot that could be different. One is, you know, uh, vibe coding, or just kind of like a lower, a desire for increased efficiency. Let's put it that way. And so like now we have like way more deploys than we ever had before. Okay, well, that's interesting. Oh, the code quality could be lower. Okay, well, that's interesting. Or maybe if we take that to an extreme now, like it's not even generated by a human. It's purely like and some agentic system that we've now running in production. To me, it seems like all of the assumptions that you've been able to make about software that's running in your production environment, like you basically have to throw those out the window once it's non-deterministic and there's an LLM running in there. And like you could kind of get away with not locking stuff down, oh, by the time it gets into production, well, it's been code reviewed by two reviewers according to our policy, and it's written by humans who like want to continue receiving a paycheck, and we do a background check when they join the company. And so like we can, yeah, it would be better to lock all this stuff down, but that's a big pain. We can basically trust the software. Like you can do that for a long time until what you're running is not, software written by a human, but is some agentic process. And it just seems like it's a matter of time. It's just a matter of time before that thing finds the delete database endpoint and calls it. And like, so now all those zero trust security, network security like ideas that you've been putting off, you're almost forced into doing that because like you cannot trust it. The only thing you can trust is like eventually it is going to try and find the way to delete your database. Just seems it seems like you really have to rethink a lot of your model of how software works when it's when there's now a big neural network that's driving it. Forget about the supply chain stuff. Just the agent itself is like a danger to like everything around it.
Yeah, I think that bit around the non-deterministic piece is where it's the scariest, right? Because an AI agent, like example, you can add like we've seen sort of attacks where it's like you ask it to run a particular shell command, but if that shell command doesn't exist, all of a sudden it starts going down a weird rabbit hole, and before you know it, you're like, why did it delete my database? Well, the chain of thought was like, okay, well, I can't find, the MySQL command, and
Therefore,
so
I'm gonna like
you know,
install. I got to download Postgres,
yeah,
obviously,
yeah,
and like
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so I think that to me is where it's scary, and again where I think hopefully for the foreseeable future we do focus around, even if these non-deterministic tools like AI agents and yada yada are used, they're used more in the way that you would hope they'd get used, which is like to fill in the blanks, to help put pieces together, to help glue deterministic pieces together, more so than to just kind of go off on their own and just do whatever they feel is appropriate, without any human oversight. Because that to me is where it gets really scary, and it gets really difficult to how would you even sort of prevent this? Because if an AI agent is given enough power and enough sort of latitude to do whatever it wants, it's very easy for that system to eventually do something bad. The same way you would say, hey, yes, you're a junior employee, but I'm never going to be giving you the root access to the database. It's just not going to happen.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, let me ask you, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Let me ask you to make some predictions for the future. Let's say uh things are changing from like week to week. The AI landscape is changing from week to week. But if you add up 52 of those weeks, we're now like, a decade into the into the future. So what do you think, when we're thinking about kind of like life in early 2027, let's just go out that far. What is the security landscape going to look like there, especially when it comes to like AI and agentic, either agentic software or software that's been partially created by LLMs or whatever it is. What's going to change over the next year?
So I think we'll see less focus on generic use of AI and more focused use of like, and we're seeing this already with like agentic skills and MCP servers
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
sort of stuff, but like more focus of, the agents you use will more or less mimic the org structure of your organization. Where, if you have stuff like a QA team or you have a platform team or whatever, you're going to have an agent that helps out with those sorts of things and helps accelerate that sort of stuff, as opposed to just sort of a generic Claude code, open code, whatever, and just sort of saying, hey, take care of QA and testing for me, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing this a little bit with that gas town idea of you want to have something like either a human or an agent as sort of a manager and helping out and sort of saying, great, you're responsible for QA. You're responsible, this other agent's responsible for helping write the code. And when there's disagreements, you don't just have a single agent figuring it out for itself, but similar to that zero trust thing, yeah, the QA stuff is like, it can sort of pull the brakes on this particular thing saying, no, 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 I don't care what the coding agent said, similar to, hey, I don't care what the developer said. This thing is clearly broken. I'm not going to, and then have either a human or a management sort of focused agent kind of takes on more of that. I think we're going to see that expand significantly. I think one of the things that, again, this is more of a out there prediction, But I think the thing that we might start to see is some of these agents operating again in ways that are less and less deterministic as we kind of go on, where software might not look like we normally have seen it in the past. Like, we're already starting to see folks asking the question, will we have code in the future, or will this essentially just be agents operating based on what they currently have as a model view of the world, and that they're constantly updating? And so your systems that look like this could change an hour later, right? I think we're going to start seeing experiments in that space. I think we're also going to see a lot more security compromises on things like that, because again, the less you can reason about a system, the easier it is to get stuff there. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we're going to see maybe in 2027. But again, things are changing so quickly. Like, various frameworks and tools that I was like, wow, this is mind blowing. 2 days later, something new comes out, and I'm like, that one blows the other one out of the water. Like, it's so, who
Yeah,
knows?
open
That could be
clause
next
old.
week.
Yeah, no one uses that anymore, Mike. Now they're
Yeah.
using some other thing. Like, that's weeks old. Yeah, yeah. It is. It is. It's not just hard to keep up. It's hard to like. Sometimes it feels like to summon the energy to be like, okay, I'm gonna have to go learn this thing, and I know that it's gonna be like obsolete in like another couple weeks.
Yeah.
That's fun. All right. So let's wrap it up with one last thing. Do you have any take home? What's your actually no, I got two questions for you. So number one is I- I'll put them in the same, I'll combine it into one. What is the take home message that you would like for our esteemed listeners? What websites should they look at? And what lessons should they have in their heads when they think about software security and AI and Kubernetes?
Sure. So I think that there's a couple of things. Like, obviously, we ourselves have a lot of articles on this out on our site, like kusari.dev, where we have a lot of blog related things. There's also a free book if you want it, around sort of thinking about supply chain security, especially thinking about it in the cloud native space.
And it's
Um,
Kusari.
yes,
Okay.
kusari.dev. Yes. And then in addition to that, I think in the open source space where we do a lot of work, so CNCF has a lot of these things. CNCF Tag Security, which again, the Technical Advisory Group for Security and Compliance, we have had a lot of great. We've had white papers on just cloud native security. We have white papers on supply chain security. We're involved in some of the white papers around AI security and zero trust, and a lot of the other ones as well. So there's a lot of great stuff there. Um, the Some stuff has moved in the past few months, so on that one you might need to do a little bit of googling it, but it's mostly in the TOC repo.
Fine.
For
I'll have my agent, find the
Yeah.
link and summarize all the content for me.
Yep. And then the last one is OpenSSF, where I think OpenSSF is doing a ton of fantastic work, not just because I'm involved, but there's a ton of great work that's happening in the space, whether it is, like, again, it's a bit more generic than just purely cloud native and Kubernetes, but we're talking, they have working groups for AI security, they have working groups for supply chain. There's projects like Zarf, which is a way to sort of run Kubernetes and related tools, air gapped. There's all sorts of great things that sort of also don't just look at, open source generically, but do kind of hit on some of those specific security related things like, Kubernetes security and that sort of thing. So OpenSSF has a lot of stuff as well. And, there's a ton of great open source projects out there, like, GUAC, which is at guac.sh. There's a new project, Darn It, which is only a few months old, that I've been writing, obviously with the help of AI. It's kind of a tool to sort of help secure the hygiene of a project, which I've been working on, and actually now some folks from NYU are getting involved in. So there's a lot out there.
And Inspector, which we in Linky
Yeah.
Land can point at our magic security sprinkles.
Yeah, it's free for all CNCF and OpenSSF projects, and maybe talk to some of the Linux Foundation folks for providing it to even more of the foundation.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, well, Mike, I really appreciate your time today and your wisdom. If anyone wants to reach out to you, can they find you, kind of on the OpenSSF website, or make a PR make a PR on one of your open good first issues?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, my personal sort of blue sky and website is also mikeneeds.rest.
Mike needs dot rust?
Rest.
Rest. Oh, rest. Okay. Mike needs dot rest. Follow him on Blue Sky, everyone. All right, Mike, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I
Great,
appreciate it
great
as well.
conversation.
Thank you very much.